to that text. And you'll notice we started in Esther 2, but actually there's Esther 1, and we'll come to that in a moment as well. But I wonder if, as we warm up, you, like Kath and I, enjoy over Christmas getting lost in a good story. Maybe it's a book. Kath loves getting new books for Christmas. I love reading a Lee Child book at Christmas. Deep, profound, meaningful escapism. Maybe like us, you like watching some of the films that become part of the Christmas routine, reruns, and we're enjoying watching some of them for the first time with our kids who are old enough to watch them now. And then going to the cinema as well. Hands up who saw Paddington 3? Not as many of you as I thought. It is more pantomime than I might have expected. Some bizarre moments, singing nuns, all that sort of stuff. You have been forewarned if you've not yet to go and see it. It's great, but not quite what I was expecting. I haven't seen We Live in Time. Our eldest saw that. She came home crying. It's very moving, apparently. We love, the point is, to get lost in good stories. And the best stories that we get lost in are actually the stories that help us find out who we really are. And I want to suggest to you that the book of Esther is one of those stories, that as we find ourselves in it, we will find ourselves in it, if you understand what I'm saying. If it was to be released as a movie, the British Board of Film Classification would be really vexed as to what rating to give it. On one level, it has all the classic ingredients of a blockbuster from Hollywood. There's a bold heroine. There are complex love interests. There's a life or death threat to the good guys. There's a villain that we love to hate. And there's a happy ending. This talk this morning really is in two parts. I'm going to kind of give you the trailer for the movie first, that overview of the whole story, and then we're going to come back to the opening scene, which is a little bit like a James Bond movie, if you've seen those, where the first 5 to 10 minutes you are literally just caught up in this very, very exciting opening sequence where all the main characters get introduced. There's all sorts of drama, and you're left going, I don't know what's going on, but I'm in. Esther 1 and her first part of Esther 2 are very much like that. So brace yourselves for a fairly quick overview, and that will set us up for the rest of the series as we unpack this story, which ultimately is a story about Esther, but is actually a story about God. More of him in a moment. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. So many of the Israelites have returned to Jerusalem. We've read about that and learned about that in the past here through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, but not all of them returned to Jerusalem and to the land. The book of Esther tells something of the story of the remaining Jewish community still living in the Persian Empire, and particularly in this citadel city of Susa, which was one of a number of cities that the king of Persia, King Xerxes, had. There are two main Jewish characters, Mordecai and Esther, and then there are two Persian characters, the King Xerxes and his senior official Haman, who is the kind of evil villain in the story. It is, as I say, a blockbuster. There is some pantomime in there if you look for it. There's some comedy, there's political intrigue, there is romance, there is a suspense moment, there's dramatic irony, there are these points of horrific, brutal reality checks, reversals of fortune and poetic justice. It's an incredibly well-written story about something that actually happened and actually changed the course of history. But it's also more complex than that. It should come, which is why I don't know how they'd grade it if it was a film. It needs to come with what we would now call a trigger warning. Like our world, and like some of your stories here, there are dark, challenging themes woven through this story. Dark themes that force us to ask really difficult questions around the dignity and rights of women. Esther finds herself in the king's harem. That's not okay. Why is that allowed? Those sorts of questions should be in our minds as we journey this book. Why does she allow herself into that situation? Why does God use it in the way he does when we would say it's not actually of God? And then there is ethnic conflict and violence through this story as Haman tries to kill off the remaining Jewish population still living in that part of the world. And that aspect of this story, I think, feels even more pertinent, does it not, as we navigate the ongoing conflicts today in Palestine and Israel. Please, let's not be afraid to go into those messy, complex bits of this story, but let's go in with eyes of faith and hope and love. The second thing we need to notice about this story is that there's one person who is not mentioned once in it and yet seems to be all the way through it. God is not mentioned once in the book of Esther. It's something that's intrigued commentators and theologians for thousands of years. Why is that? Why is he not in the book? And if he's not in the book, why is the book in the book? But the book is in the book, and maybe God is in the story, but we just need to learn how to see him there. It turns out, most would agree, that it's a brilliant technique by an anonymous author that invites us to read this story more carefully than we might, because we have to do some of the work for ourselves. We have to find the activity of God in and through the life of Esther and Mordecai. And what you'll find if you read it, and my encouragement is please start reading it when you get home. Read through the whole book. It'll take you 20 minutes so that by the time you come next Sunday, you've read it a couple of times and you know the story because there's so much in there. The more you read it, the more you will see signs of God at work in it, even though he's not mentioned once. Here is the key point as we start. God's apparent absence and ambivalence is part of the book's very sophisticated way of talking about God's presence and providence. It reads on one level like God's not there, that he doesn't care. But actually, the more you understand the book, you realize, no, God is very, very present and far from ambivalent, actually is working providentially in the lives of Esther and Mordecai for the whole of the world. And that is good news for you and for me. Because what that means is, even when it doesn't seem like it for us, even when we look at our life and our moments and we think God is absent, he's not there, so maybe he doesn't care, this gives us fresh faith to believe, no, God is at work in this moment in my life. And there is providential hope that I can look for and seek out and trust in. And not just in the parts of our life that are going well. Those bits of our lives that we think we know pretty well are aligned with the will of God for us. Actually, crucially, God is always working in the chaos and the conflict and the compromise of our lives. That is good news for you and for me. God is always working. Turn to the person next to you and say to them, God is always working. You weren't so keen on that. We're going to practice a bit more audience participation as we go forward. God is always working. If you remember one thing from this morning, please may it be that. Let me nerd out on you for just one moment, because one of the ways we see this is in the structure of the book of Esther. Now, it is what is known as a chiasm. It's a structure, a technique, very clever technique that's used in literature, often in narrative, but also poetry, where there's a symmetrical pattern. And what that pattern does is it highlights for us the key themes and points of the story so we can see a trend, an arc, a journey. And actually, as we see that, we can see something of what's going on in the plot, even if it's not explicit. Okay? So when we think about where is God in this story, some of the structure helps us see that. And so I'm just going to help you see it. So it sets us up, as I say, for the rest of the series. This is the trailer part 1 bit that we're in right now. And so if you notice, next slide, please, Luke, here is the structure, and you can't see this very well, I don't think, but here is the structure of Esther. On the left-hand side, there's part A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a second version, F, E, D, C, B, A. It starts with the splendor of the Persian king and the banquets. And if you know the story, it ends with the splendor of Mordecai and 2 feasts. So 2 kings, 2 feasts, topping and tailing, and the journey goes down and round and back up. There is a pivot point right at the bottom of this chaotic structure. That's chapter 6, which we'll get to, where it all changes. The entire story hinges on the activities of Mordecai and Haman in chapter 6. But we notice this structure. It's deliberate to help us see what is going on and what God was doing in the midst of it. So it starts with the splendor of the Persian king and his 2 banquets. Esther becomes queen. Mordecai saves the king. Haman is elevated to power. He then has this decree to destroy the Jewish people. Esther and Mordecai have a plan to reverse the decree. Esther has her first banquet. Haman plans Mordecai's execution. That's part 1 of the film. But then it flips, as I say, in chapter 6. And what we then have is Esther's second banquet. And rather than Mordecai being executed, it's Haman, his arch rival. Things are starting to change and go in the opposite direction. Esther and Mordecai continue to plan to reverse the decree. Mordecai's counter decree kicks in to cancel out the one that happened earlier that releases the Jewish people. Mordecai is then elevated to power, not Haman. Queen Esther and Mordecai save the Jewish people, and it ends with these 2 feasts, as I said. Can you see that structure, that story? It's really deliberate, and it's there to help us see God's providence. The author is wanting us to understand, by seeking out God in the story, just how good God is and just how powerful he is. It doesn't look like he's there, but he's there in it all, just like your story and mine. So Michael V. Fox, not to be confused with Michael J. Fox, who is a theologian, I'm dating myself there, says this about the structure of Esther. When we scrutinize the text of Esther for traces of God's activity, we are doing what the author has made us do. The author would have us probe the events we witness in our own lives in the same way. The author, and I love this phrase, the author is teaching a theology of possibility. A theology of possibility. Here's that possibility: the willingness to face history with an openness to the possibility of divine providence, even when history seems to weigh against its likelihood, as it did in the dark days after Haman's decree. In this way, the book offers a stance of profound faith. If we can see that God is at work, even though we can't see the work of God, we can face anything with a theology of possibility. It is possible that God can turn this, which means we fear nothing. And it means we give everything for the cause of the kingdom in and through this cultural moment we find ourselves in. Esther pushes us to look at our own lives and to consider how God might be actively working in the midst of the messy moments of my life, even in the face of a threat or tragedy or loss or mistake or sin, in order to outwork his good and perfect purposes for me and for us. That's the call of us as the people of God, to read this text not just as something that helps us see God for ourselves, but also helps us then be something for God and for other people. And what you notice, going back to the structure, is that essentially there's a direction of travel, there's a narrative. The first half is all about demise. It's about loss, it's about threat. There's a dark trend there. But then there's an intervention through Mordecai and Esther by God that turns everything round and actually allows for the opposite in the second half of the story, that redemptive journey. And we need to see that that is not just in the book of Esther. That's actually in the story of Jesus, which is the story of the world. And I would suggest is also our story. It's our story once in the sense of we were without Jesus, and then we had this pivot encounter moment for our whole lives when we became Christians, which allows us to live into the promises of redemption. But it's actually a story that we can live out in any given moment, in any given day, because within that great life with Christ, where we know one day he, as Cass said, will return and it all shall be well, we still have crap days. That's from the original Hebrew. It's okay to say that. We have days where we think it's all going wrong. Oh God, where are you? But we can remember, no, this is the God who is working all the time, despite what comes at me and despite what's in me. And actually, when I come to the pivot of human history, Jesus Christ, he can redeem anything. So Deborah Reed, who's written probably one of the best commentaries on this book, says this reversal motif has providence at the center, God's activity at the center. The reversal occurs because actions of powerful people are overturned by similar actions from a different power source. Although God's name is never mentioned, the implication is that such power and providence can only be divine. But here's the key thing to notice. God needs agents. This is evidently God's power outworked through Esther and Mordecai. But he needed Esther and he needed Mordecai. And God needs you and he needs me. He doesn't, in a sense, need you or me, but he needs humans because that's how he's designed it. That's how people experience most of the time the things of God. And so you and I are caught up in the same story that Esther and Mordecai are caught up in. And we live in a moment in history where there are dark forces. There are strong, powerful people whose determination is to bring destruction to others. And we worship a God who has once and for all defeated the powers of evil and death on the cross. And now through the church and by the power of his Spirit is standing against that and is ushering in a redemptive kingdom. And you and I are agents of it. And so we need to live with theology of possibility. We need to be confident that God is always working. That whatever we face and whatever's going on, you and I can, for ourselves and for others and for the world around us, stand in the gap and say, actually, even though he doesn't look like he's there, it doesn't look like God cares, I can tell you, he is there and he is working. Let's go find him. We're talking about what it is to trust in God's presence and providence, even when we can't see it working, even when we don't understand what's happening. Are you up for that? Great. So that's the trailer. That's the invitation of the story over the next 5.5 weeks. And let's now come round to the opening sequence. Because actually, we can read it and miss some of the key things and miss what I've just said already being sown into that early stage, because there's quite a lot of detail that we can get lost in. So turn, if you've got a Bible open or on, to Esther chapter 1. We're not going to go through it verse by verse. We don't have time, but have a look in your own time. That would be great. This first chunk, Esther 1, all the way through to the end of verse 17, which we'll get to in a moment, of chapter 2, functions, as I say, like that opening sequence to a big picture blockbuster movie. It begins with the story of the king of Persia, Xerxes, throwing 2 elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, basically half the year. The grandiose purpose being to display his greatness and his splendor and his wealth and his power. So imagine the opening scene of a movie, and you're taken into this huge court, and there's this vast banquet, and it's the best of everything, and everybody's there in their very best. And here we are sort of watching in, wondering what is going on. This is the king of the greatest empire ever known at that point in history. There's a map here just to show you how big it was. I don't know whether you can see that. We'll send these slides around. But it basically covered what would now be Pakistan all the way down to Sudan. It was a huge part of the world. The first feast, which lasts 180 days, had all the officials and nobles there. Now, probably not all at the same time, probably a rolling invite list. But we're meant to imagine that here we have King Xerxes and all his acolytes and sycophants, all the political people, they're there, and they're being lavishly blessed to remember that they should worship this king. They need to give him this allegiance. The second feast then follows on. No one's entirely sure why he decides to have a 7-day part 2, possibly a kind of hangover recovery. Some think it might be because he'd actually just got married to Queen Vashti and it was actually a wedding reception. We don't know. But notice in verses 5, 6, 7, and 8, the lavish description of the grounds. Again, we're meant to see this kind of power and wealth. There are couches made of gold and silver. There are marble pavements. There are gold goblets that you drink from with limitless royal wine. It's a picture of how Tim will set up St. Helens for the pub quiz in just a few weeks' time. Not. Verse 10 is where the drama kicks in. So there's this kind of, can you see it? Bam, here's the moment. The king is drunk. And he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, is brought into the party so he can show off her beauty. And the narrator makes clear that this is not because he wants to honor her, he wants everyone to see his beloved. No, it's because he wants everyone to see how beautiful his possession wife is, to make him look even more impressive. It's not okay. Verse 13, she refuses to come. It doesn't tell us why deliberately, because the author probably wants us to go, why didn't she come? But at the very least, I think we can it indicates that she had some sense of dignity and self-worth. And perhaps it got to the point where she was willing to risk everything to not be a commodity, because women are not commodities. No one is a commodity. And it turns out that this king who says he has all this power and wealth actually doesn't have any power at all, really, because he can't persuade his wife to come to the party. And as well as being largely powerless, actually, as a king, it turns out he's also something of a fool, which is a thread that you'll note comes through all of the script, all of this passage, all of the book of Esther. He's surrounded by these people who give him really duff advice. And actually, you'll notice throughout the book that he doesn't do anything without the advice of his advisors, who are all sycophants. So they've got no vested interest in telling him the right thing. And so we end up with this ridiculous scenario where what essentially is a conflict between a husband and a wife becomes a national state of emergency. It's so easy for narcissistic leaders to blow things up. And which is why we need to have a different kind of power and a different kind of leadership, modeled by the people of God. Sermon for another time. So he reacts to this disobedience from Vashti. She breaks the commands of the laws of the king. And so he issues a decree, a legal decree. He has no other mechanism to get back at her. And essentially what he says is in verse 19, he bans her from ever again approaching the king. And a decree is then made that all Persian men are to be masters of their own homes, in short, to prevent that happening to them. So you've got this blatant misogyny kicking in out of fear, which is the driver for that kind of thing all the time. Because he's drunk and angry. And there's a political power play going on. And so all of a sudden, the destiny of a whole nation is hijacked by that one drunken moment. It's pantomime. It's soap opera. It's political thriller. It's ridiculous. And yet it's true and had huge implications for so many people. Which brings us to chapter 2 and the part that we had read by Di. The king, we're told, remembers what happened and what he decreed. He basically comes out of his drunken stupor, we think, and realizes, oh, heck, I possibly overreacted. But he's already put in place a legal decree that is now binding. So he's got one of two options. One is he undoes his own legal decree, but that's a sign of weakness. And so he's trapped by his own stupidity and is forced instead to follow through on that. He's bound by this new law. And so he decides essentially to hold a beauty pageant across the entire empire to find the new queen that would replace Queen Vashti. And it says in the scripture, doesn't it, that it literally says the word virgins, and most theologians agree that to have been suitable to be the next queen, that would have to be part of your status. And so here we are in this moment, and I don't know about you, but I'm thinking, this really does feel like a bad soap opera right now. This is all going horribly wrong, and I don't think I really want to hear more of this story. Then, at this moment, along come Esther and Mordecai, verses 5, 6, and 7 in this story, and it already at that point begins to change. Partly because of what they do, but actually crucially because of who they are and who they worship. In contrast to Xerxes, Esther and Mordecai, we're told, are ordinary Jewish people. They're still living in Susa, like I said earlier. They are related. Mordecai is older. He's brought Esther up because she's been orphaned. And what happens, we see in verses 8 to 13, is she's taken into the citadel in Susa by those finding the next queen. She gets caught up in this outworking of this decree. And like all the other girls taken along, she doesn't want to go. None of them would have wanted to do that. It's not how it might look. It would have been a horrific way of life, but it was imposed upon them. It's not okay. But Esther is in that situation, and God uses her despite that, because God can work through any situation, because God is always working. Now notice verse 10, she's been told by Mordecai not to disclose her identity, to not say, oh, actually, I'm Jewish. She presents as Persian. Side note, this is in contrast to Daniel, which is a similar story about a Jewish person who's in exile in Babylon at that point, used mightily by God to bring destiny to the nations, who does disclose his Jewish identity, does actually operate out of that. Which one is best? Which one is right? Neither. God is always at work in the specific reality moments of our lives. And sometimes it's one thing and sometimes it's another, which is why there are no blueprints for Christianity. You've got to work it out in faith, in relationship with God and your friends. So here she has this moment where she has to basically head into the same year-long quest to find the next queen. And if you read on the rest of chapter 2, the bit we didn't have time to read, verses 12 through to 18, what you see is that the king becomes obsessed with Esther and makes her the new queen of Persia. And it ends just like the story began, with a feast in honor of her. Notice that thread that I said, the chaotic structure, it's there. And I want to conclude by just helping us tease out something of what we heard about in the trailer part of this talk, that even at this point, we can actually see, if we look hard enough, something of the providence of God. And we can learn something, even from this bit of the story, for us. And the key is to notice a phrase that is used 3 times in chapter 2. And the phrase is this: Esther gained favor. Esther gained favor. Verse 9, we see that she gains favor first with Haggai. This is the officer who is appointed to oversee the harem of these girls. She finds favor with him, and so she gets special treatment. She gets to go to the really best spa treatment. She gets all of the extra maids, all of that sort of stuff. And that ultimately will have helped, no doubt, her be seen by the king. It leads to her elevation to the throne. The second time we notice is in verse 15, where it says, all who saw her gave her favor. So she's there in the court, but for some reason she had favor with everybody. Almost certainly not just because of what she looked like, because all the girls that had been picked out would have had a similar sort of physical attraction. No, there's obviously something more beautiful than that going on, rightly so. And then finally, with the king himself, verse 17. And the key point is this: favor, when it's godly favor, even in the midst of a chaotic conflict, compromise moment like this one, isn't something that you can earn, build, accrue, create. It's gifted by God to you for that situation. Esther doesn't do anything other than one thing, and yet suddenly has all of this favor that leads her to being raised up to that position of influence and authority, which means that she is positioned to stand against the evil schemes to eradicate her people. And we'll come to it when we get to chapter 4, but you'll know the famous phrase, if you've been around the church for any length of time, for such a time as this. What does she do? Interestingly, she does one thing. She does as Mordecai told her. She does as Mordecai told her. Mordecai said, do not disclose your identity. And if you noticed in the story, it says every day he walked around the citadel checking in on her well-being. He's doing it for her benefit. He gave her that instruction for her benefit, and he's there checking in, loving her as best as he's able to, because he can't go in to check she's okay. Now, what do we need to notice about that? This is important for the rest of the story, because Mordecai represents the wisdom of God. Mordecai in this story, and it's the counter to the king who's the fool, which should make us think about Proverbs and the wisdom literature, the wise one and the foolish one. Mordecai is the wise, discerning, elder, mature follower of God. And he has discerned his wisdom and discernment for Esther. Don't disclose your identity. She's obedient to the wisdom of God. Often that comes through others for us, right? We discern it in community, and she trusts in that. And it's cost her, and it comes at a compromise, and she would have been going, but that means I'm eating food I shouldn't eat, in contrast to Daniel. That means I'm doing things I don't want to do, in contrast to Daniel. But she trusts in that, and there is favor as a result. You and I, when we find ourselves in these moments where it doesn't feel like God is there, and it doesn't feel like God cares, where we have to go looking for his providence and his presence, what's the one thing we can do? We can trust in the wisdom of God. We stay obedient to what we know God has spoken. And we stand firm in that, even when it's costly, even when it's hard. Sometimes we'll need others to hold our hands up. Sometimes we need others to stand around us. Sometimes we need others to carry us. But we do that in faith because God is always working. And what she does is what the only thing she knows to do is to be true to who she is and true to what the wisdom of God was through Mordecai, the one she's been raised by and who sees God in him. She trusts in that wisdom. And actually, over and over again, his wisdom is what prevails, and she outworks it. And that is why God is able to give her favor. And then she becomes a conduit for his power and his purpose. This is important because tomorrow morning, if not before the end of this day, each and every one of us will go into situations which we wouldn't necessarily choose to be in, where we will feel at times a degree of chaos or conflict or compromise, and we're wondering, God, are you in this? And how am I going to do this? And I don't even want to be here, but I find myself here. What am I meant to do? Well, what we are meant to do is what we can do, which is to trust in the wisdom of God. Do what God has said. Be who God has called us to be. To trust in that. And trust that that will earn us favor in the midst of all of this. So that his ultimate power and purposes, not just for us, but for all people, can be outworked. That's how the kingdom advances. That's how it works. There's one example that I can give you from the scriptures just to iron out this point, to head it hammer it home. And it's simply this, that Jesus Christ finds himself in a garden the night that he's been betrayed. He looks to the cross the next day. He's in a moment. He doesn't want to be in it. He's not chosen it. Where it feels like God isn't there. And he's wondering, God, do you care? My God, he cries, why have you forsaken me? But something kicks in. It's obedience. But actually it's more than obedience, it's faith in the God that he knows is working even in his death. And so he hangs on a cross, dies, and in doing so defeats sin and evil and is raised to new life. Because God was at work in the chaos and conflict and compromise of that moment. And so if it works for Esther, and if it works for Jesus, it works for us. Amen? Okay, let's take a moment to be still, and then we're going to pray, because we don't do this in our own strength. We do it all in the power of the Holy Spirit. So I'm just a heads up, I'm going to invite those of you who know that you need to come and be filled again with the Holy Spirit so that you can keep going, particularly if you're in moments where it doesn't look like God is there, to come and be prayed for. But let's take a moment first to be still. What's God saying to you? Do you need to hear from what I've just said?